Good afternoon, everyone. And for those who I haven't yet met or had the chance to chat to today, my name is Jessica Perry and I work in the domestic recruitment team. So hopefully I get a chance to chat to all of you before the end of the day. So I'd now like to again welcome to the stage our speakers, Professor Peter Shergold, Professor Martin Westwell and Professor Jennie Shaw. Over the course of the day, we have had insights into the future of the education sector as a whole, as well as some insights into the innovations that are on the horizon. So in a few moments, you will have the opportunity to ask our speakers some of your questions. But just before we open up to the floor, we have a couple of questions of our panellists today. So firstly, to the whole panel, as we embark on this kind of next wave of innovation in education, if you like, what do you see as some of the greatest opportunities for the school sector and also for universities?
All right, I'll kick off. Certainly, I won't speak for the schools, but for the universities, everyone's mentioned micro-credentials. I think we're all getting into those, and the idea of stackable degrees, or some universities call them bespoke degrees. I think that's the idea of seeing it as a partnership between the student and the university, and acknowledging that, by the time the students get to us, certainly by the time they're at the end of first year, they're adults. We take a lot of school leavers who are still 17, but I think, we're treating them as adults and letting them make some of their decisions with guidance from us. So I think that's where it's actually really important. It gets back to that idea I was talking about before about having that good guidance from the schools, but then I think having good guidance and support once they come to university so they're actually well prepared. And I don't think it matters how they do that. I don't think it matters if they're then enrolling in a full-time bachelor's or they get a bachelor's over a number of years by stacking things together that ends up the same way. And I think it's just recognising different learners.
From my point of view, I think what we're seeing is increasingly in education, and of course in the world's getting more complex, and that's creating more needs of our students. And so when we think about an opportunity, I'm really thinking about what's the opportunity for us to progress our purpose. And so what we're seeing for schools is that that purpose statement is probably narrowed by things like the ATAR or particular aspects of education. We can get that narrowing. I think what the opportunity here is for the system, almost kind of the education ecosystem, to be much more sophisticated in the way that it recognises the different purpose of different schools. The tight and loose, we've all got the same tight, we're all tight on the same meeting the educational needs of students, but we've got to be more flexible on what that means. I think part of that then is about redefining what success is in education, not saying it's not this and now it's that, but broadening it out so that our community, our parents, students themselves are not defining themselves in terms of what they're not. They're not this narrow thing, but in fact are defining themselves in terms of what they are, and that the opportunity is for schools to be more responsive and be more flexible to meet those educational needs for the kids and to create that success for all students.
I think for me what's exciting is that I honestly think there is a mood for change now, a mood out in the public, and a greater opportunity for change in most governments. I think it's been really interesting. One of the things that I've had to do is to persuade ministers it's worth moving in this, because you'll find there is actually quite a lot of public support for re-looking at careers advice for life. I can tell you it strikes a chord with people. For moving away simply from ATAR at secondary school, there's a great well of support. Now, what we've got to do is help people to be able to articulate that. And then, as I say, what also excites me, I think, to go back to what Martin was saying about tight, loose, we are starting to get this right, that, we can make quite bold changes and change constructs, but then without getting in too much prescriptive detail, where we can allow the flexibility at the system level or at the school level.
Fantastic. I think it's a really exciting time, and I'm certainly inspired. I don't know about the rest of you guys in the room to be working in education at this time as we embark on this change. So another question for the panel is, when we look at learner profiles, and we had a lot of discussion around it today, it's obviously potentially a kind of cross-sector approach, if you like. So what role do you think universities might have to play in working with these learner profiles as they develop over time?
I'm happy to start on that. I think many of the universities actually are already doing this. We're trying to identify what are the attributes that we think we need in our students and that our students should take forward. So I think there is a considerable opportunity to work together. I don't think we can work too much. I mean, in a sense, we know pretty broadly about what the 21st century skills are. We can articulate them in various ways and then leave, as I say, flexibility around that. I think the challenge for all of us, it doesn't matter whether we're at secondary school or at university or at TAFE, is genuinely having teachers who understand that one of their key roles is not just to convey content, but actually helping their students understand the underlying attributes that they are acquiring. And that's why I think, at secondary schools, professional teachers are crucial. I think we do have to trust the teacher. But it's helping teachers to say, well, this is this framework, and what we really want you to do is help your students understand how you can use this framework to think about the way you can develop and then demonstrate these learnings.
I think for me, it's that we work as a system, and as part of that, it's the authenticity. All of this work will be killed as soon as it becomes inauthentic for students, parents, employers, universities. What I mean by, and there's a number of different ways to think about that. One is, if we end up doing a test for some of these capabilities, I think it will make it inauthentic, because students will learn how to do the test, as I was talking about literacy and numeracy before, rather than it being an authentic representation of the behaviours that students have shown. That'll kill it. We've got to work, we are already in South Australia, Northern Territory, working together with the universities so that universities can have an authentic voice to signal to the students about what makes for success in this course or that course or something else. The ATAR sends an inauthentic message to students. So we want that authenticity. So I think that's going to be the thing that we can work on together to really be purposeful and intentional in our working together to hold on to that authenticity.
I think just to add to those two comments, I won't say very much, but of course we're very interested at the entrance end for students, and there are areas where we do look at the equivalent of learner profiles right now. But of course, that's actually always been one of our aims for where we get a student to. So my view is, once we take in a student, we've taken them in at all different levels and all different abilities with all different kinds of skills and personal attributes. But at the end of it, we have some really clear graduate attributes, and we have really clear learning outcomes, and we have some really clear sets of generic skills, and it's our duty to make sure they've got those. And that's a real challenge when it comes to generalist degrees like a BA, like a Bachelor of Science, because we also build into those degrees lots and lots of choice. And we're hoping at the end of it that through that choice that the students have actually chosen a path that ends up really being able to show that they've got those skills as well. I'd say the other part of the puzzle we have to work on from our perspective is the accrediting bodies. Some are good, some are not so good. So we can do all this work, but then we'll have an accrediting body, and I won't name any, but some of them are great, and some of the others will say, yes, but we need a test. And it needs to be this result. Yeah. And it has to be this test that we apply to every single student at every single university. And I think one of the wonderful things about universities in Australia is we are a very broad church. So the university I am at now is a research-intensive university. We are preparing a lot of our students for higher degrees, so bachelor's and on. And again, it's part of that lifelong learning. We are preparing a lot of students who go out with a degree, come back 10 years later wanting to upskill, and I think that's fantastic too. But I've also worked at universities where most of the students are part-time, most of them are older students, most of them have families and work commitments. And the idea is you want to get everyone to the same point at the end. And I think there are lots of different ways to do that.
Can I just add, because I think that's spot on. One of the dangers we sometimes have is looking at universities only from the perspective of schools, because in a sense that does tend to emphasise ATAR. Whereas the last data I looked at on entry into universities generally, only 37% of people entering university got there on the basis of ATAR. It is that significant numbers now coming to the universities out of vocational education, mature age students, all sorts of different tests, portfolios. So one of the challenges you've got when you're looking from school is you think ATAR is the route in. And that's what I'm saying. We could be said, no, don't worry. Even if your ATAR fails, there are now all these other routes if you think that university is for you.
Fantastic. It's great to hear about that kind of authentic approach to assessment from the student's perspective and that whole of student learning as well. So now we will open up to the floor for questions. So please raise your hand if you have a question and a microphone will come to you. You might notice my colleague Tony and I have swapped roles today, for this afternoon. And so he'll bring your microphone and Tia has a microphone as well. You've got two there, Monica. Just quickly, I just ask that you wait until the microphone comes to you to make sure that our attendees online can hear the discussion and be a part of it as well. We will have discussion or questions come through from Zoom too. So if you're on Zoom, please send them through.
So, got a couple of questions. One is, first of all, thank you to the three of you for sharing. I certainly see a synergy between the three of you. And so it's been very interesting to hear your agreement. I can't help but think, coming from a very academic-focused school, where, you need 98 of ATAR to get into physiotherapy, how you would kind of look at replacing that, or, there was some talk at the table as well about students gaming the system using a Certificate 3 in business, for example, to get into med or dentistry. There seems to still be a danger, I think, of gaming, and not quite sure how the universities are going to be able to address that for equity's sake, that you are getting the right students for the right reasons. So I guess, the other third thing, I guess, so the third thing is, if you're looking at reducing focus on ATAR, does that mean you'll be reducing focus on GPA as well? Because right now, if you look at the number of students who don't move, I think University of Adelaide only has 10 clinical psychology masters. So all of a sudden, you've got all this huge pool of psych students hoping to do honors, then get into masters. You're looking at redefining everything in education. And I just have some questions around integrity around that, and safety for us as the consumer. I want a doctor who is really properly trained. I want a psychologist who's properly trained. I'd like to know and be assured that there's academic rigor behind whether you're doing a Bachelor of Arts or whether you're doing physio or medicine across the board. So I'm hearing what you're saying. I'm thinking this sounds positive, but I've just got this warning light going on that are we tipping too far over to accommodate everything for everyone, and in the end we will lack the intellectual and academic rigor that we still need.
I don't mind having a start at that. Look, we know that the present system is gamed, and probably whatever we put there, parents and teachers and students will think, what do I need to do to maximise my chance to do it? I mean, one of the bad things, the worst things about ATAR, which I find it quite extraordinary, even as a university ranking tool, it is dysfunctional in that it actually often persuades students not to aspire to educational excellence. The number of students I have met who have been advised not to do advanced level maths because it actually may lower their ATAR score. And then they come into university, and I would, of course, much preferred, if they're doing engineering, that they've done advanced level maths. So, yes, we're going to have that all. One of the things, as I and perhaps Martin have been thinking about these sort of learner profiles to measure these underlying attributes, is the danger of that being gamed. And you only have to think of the United States, where American universities have a SAT test, and they say, one of the things, what have you done working for community, and what have you done in sport? And we know what that leads you to. It leads parents paying large lumps of money to bribe people to pretend their two daughters are excellent rowers because you get points on that. So what I've got very much at the forefront of my mind is, as we try and do a broader assessment of people's capabilities and attributes, to do it in a way which doesn't lend itself to gaming, or the sort of gaming that can just reinforce the inequities we've already got in the system. And that's why, as I was looking at the learner's profile, I tended to move away from just what you do at the school or what you do in, extracurricular activities, and really come down to focus on things like the learning you acquired from doing part-time work, which in fact is predominantly done by more people in lower SES. So you've got to constantly think, how can this be gained, because it always will, but where we can get a better assessment of the whole individual. All I know is an assessment of an individual that's 98.5 is not an assessment of the individual.
If I can comment on that too. Look, we're not doing away with the GPA. I think it's actually different. We're talking about different things. So one of these is about getting students into university, and that's what we're talking about when we're thinking about alternatives to ATAR or ATAR Plus or whatever, okay? But once they're in, we expect them to meet a certain standard. And certainly if it's in one of the allied health degrees or medicine, that's when the accrediting boards absolutely come in, because there are standards that are set by the accrediting boards that we need to meet. So I think that's not an issue. Once they're in, if they're not hitting that certain level of learning, they won't progress. And the same for all our, even the general degrees. I mean, they have to hit certain level there because we have TEXA that sets a certain requirement, so we do insist on that. But we're saying it's not everything. And I think the GPA, absolutely necessary if you're trying to get into something like the Masters in Clinical Psychology, absolutely everything. The ATAR, as I said this morning, it's not going to go away for those really competitive, capped entry programs around the country. But I think even with medicine, there are so many different pathways in now, undergraduate, postgraduate, interview, no interview. So people have been trying, and it comes and goes in cycles. I've been around long enough to have seen things at one university, where I was before in Sydney, go from undergraduate to postgrad and back again, interviews, no interviews, So we know that people know whatever is there in place isn't perfect, so I think it's a good thing we're always looking for something else that might be better. The lovely thing about universities is we can experiment. And I think we've got an environment where we do have TEXA, we do have accrediting bodies, but within that we actually have a certain amount of freedom to try things out, and try things out on our mostly adult students, so there is an element of willingness to participate in the way we are doing things.
I think from my point of view, your point is a really good one, right? And that's why in those elements of Thrive, we've got that deep understanding and skillful action. Definitely need that, no doubt about it. And I think if you look at something like the ATAR, because one of the inputs into that is just how popular a course is. And so we're saying, this level of knowledge is sufficient, and we're going to reward you for a higher level of knowledge in this and other subjects, especially subjects that scale well. So that's okay, but is that really what's needed? If this is a sufficient level of knowledge, if more knowledge is beneficial, great, let's say so. But if this is sufficient and what also leads to success is something else, and we know what that something else is, well, let's say that as well. So in the examples that you've given, I think you want a really high level of expertise. So what do you need to be successful at that? What are we going to say? You need that level of expertise. And there are other things where you need certain level combinations of expertise and other characteristics and those things. So let's say that when that is the situation. So I think it's a broadening of making a good match. So back to that idea of, from my perspective, making a transition from year 12 to university, or from year 12 to an apprenticeship or employment in some other way. Let's try and make it, if it's authentic, we can create these conversations that are about good matches.
I think today's been a great chance to start those conversations, or continue those conversations rather, about how we make those matches. Is there any other questions from the floor? We haven't had any come through on Zoom yet.
Yep.
Hi, I hope I'm not being too critical here. I am concerned that we have at stage 1 level in SACE 80 credits that don't count for anything. I can roll up to class, sit there, not do much, not English, not literature, and not maths. We'll fight our way to get some of those kids through so they get their SACE and our school doesn't come under, we're not doing the right thing. I've taught him both, and that does concern me. It concerns me that and it almost seems to what you've said is that I think that maybe there's two university pathways. One that's over 21, where people have been to school, got out, done a bit of work, and they can go back into university, and they don't need prerequisites because they understand what they really have to do. But we've got students in year 11 and 12 who are no longer working particularly hard because they know they can get into uni through various pathways, but they actually don't develop the disciplines of study in those times. And then people are also concerned, their parents are concerned, that they'll start uni in those times and drop out just after they gain a HECS debt. And that really worries me. I think, and then another point, the variety of choices, which I totally agree with, but where does that fit with schools with limited numbers of teachers to teach those subjects? And yes, we can go to get those kids enrolled in uni and we lose funds from our school. There's a variety of questions there and it's probably convoluted, but yes, over to you guys.
Well, I'm going to just take one part of it and leave you to think, which is this idea I'm really strong on now of progressive credentialing. And it is for that reason, so to recognise everything that someone successfully completes. Now, we know that in vocational education, and I've certainly had ministers who've always worried about this, often only 55 to 60% of people who start a Cert 3 or a Cert 4 actually finish it. Now, that sounds disastrous, except when I was the chair of the National Centre for Vocational Education Research, we did a lot of student surveys, and here's the interesting thing. The people who'd just gone to an RTO or TAFE and done a number of units of a Cert 3 or 4 and left were as happy with their TAFE or RTO experience as people who completed the Cert 3 or 4. So what's going on? I think this is great. I think young people are voting with their feet. They actually know, in this instance, it's not the Cert 3 or Cert 4. Actually, what I want is, in effect, badging. What my employer wants to see is that I've done those 3 subjects. I've now got students at Western Sydney University who I know are also studying some vocational education at the same time they're using university education. So this is one of my hopes for the future. In fact, we are struggling, I think, as educational systems to keep up with what young people are actually doing. They are making these decisions to put together their own educational packages with a bit of a Cert 3, a bit of a Cert 4, some micro-credentials here. What I want to do is to make sure that people are able to put those together as the package they need for employment, and not, as I say, to have spent either a year or 2.5 years and end up thinking they have nothing from the experience. So that's why, in my view, I think many universities will start to look about, well, let's give credentials on the way through to the degree. One of the things the Commonwealth Government has done in the last 2 years is given much more money to universities to do these short courses below undergraduate standard. They are extraordinarily popular. You know, I think most of us universities, oh, really? Is this complex? Is this difficult? You know, is it going to work financially? I'm sure you found the same. Very, very popular with students. Like the idea of coming to university for a short period and ending up with a lesser credential.
Go ahead, and I'll follow you.
I want to pick up your point about year 11. I'm a bit horrified by that that students might think that this isn't worth anything. If they're thinking that in year 11, when does that start? Is that in year 10 or 9 or 8? Or, you know, where does it... And that learning has to be for something at the end of it. That I'm only going to do this learning, I'm only going to go out and learn this thing if I'm going to get a badge or something back for it. And I was just reflecting back on, years ago I did the Australian Institute for Company Directors course, and you can choose to do the certification or not. And I chose not to, because I didn't really care about the badge. I cared about the learning that I was going to get out of that course and how that would... I would use that in my job. I didn't want to get my next job because I'd done the course. I wanted to get my next job because I'd demonstrated that I can add value through what I'd learned in that course. And so if Year 11 students are thinking that, then I am a bit horrified by that. You know, one of the reasons why we don't take year, where the credits, where we don't say, year stage 1 and stage 2, and we really kind of focus on some of those aspects in stage 2 and really go hard with the quality assurance in stage 2 and some of those things, is to create a bit more flexibility around stage 1 so that students can stay in that learning zone. They can have a go at a course and then maybe switch later on. So it's really not that high stakes nature of stage 1, and they can be learners. And if students have already got to that point where they're thinking, well, this doesn't count for anything, so I'm not going to bother, they're going to do the same when they're in first year at uni. They're going to do the same. I think that's, yes, horrified by that prospect.
If I could just pick that up, I think, again, what we're interested in, I've had this conversation with a few schools recently, is in you being able to keep the students motivated and passionate through years 11 and 12. And I know that's a struggle. I've got a year 10, so, and he's one of those ones that it can go up and down. But I think, it is actually all those things around the school experience. And I think it's a bit like university. Students can come to university, but they can do it all online. But why do they come to university if they're coming to face-to-face classes at university? It's actually to meet with teachers, to talk to people, to make friends, to be in a particular environment. And I actually think that's the other bit we've really got to work on. And that's where we've actually got to recognise that some schools, some universities, just a better resource to do that than others. And that I think we actually need to put the support where it's really, really needed. So within my own context of my own university, we are hoping the students have come to us motivated and excited. We really are. We're hoping to get them in that first stage where they are motivated and excited, and then build on that and not have them become discouraged and disheartened, because it's really hard. I'd say the only thing, we just talked about this before, Peter, I mentioned, yesterday was our census date at the university. And normally it gets to a couple of weeks before census and we see all those students thinking, oh, this is not for me. They've had 1 or 2 weeks of classes and we just see the enrolments go like this. It didn't happen this year. So I think last year was an anomaly in a lot of ways. I think school students' experience of school last year, I hope, was one that's never going to be repeated around the world. It was a really tough year, and we realise it's still tough in a lot of jurisdictions outside Australia. I'm just wondering how that translates them to coming to university, whether they're just so excited to be at university that that's going to be wonderful, whether they're hanging on because they're scared to let go. So we just don't know yet. And I think with a lot of these things that we're trying and experimenting, not all of them will work. But I'm hoping that we're actually going to keep the student experience at the heart of it, because I think if we get that right, then a lot of the rest of it will fall into place.
Wonderful. I think there's a question over here. Tia, from before.
Howdy, folks. Hello. Howdy. Would you give us a bit of detail around the learner profile and what kind of format you would think that would take, and then whether or not the learner's profile would supplant or augment a CV or a resume for potential employment?
You do the first bit, I'll do the second.
Okay, so working on this now, so let me tell you about kind of the intent, and we'll get into that. We might change some things around. So from the learner profile point of view, as I talked about, they've got these kind of broad capabilities, so it can be expressed at that level, and then breaking it down into dimensions and even those indicators, the behaviour level. At one of those levels, so what we're looking for is a kind of some kind of graphical representation of that. We'll turn that into data that can be used, sucked up by SATAC and used by the universities in whatever ways they might choose to use that. Part of the point of it, I think, and part of the certainly the aspiration, is that it would look like a dashboard that the students could modify. So if they're, for example, applying for a job or looking for a particular apprenticeship or something like that, and they can say, and they can see what the employer wants, what we want to do is give them the opportunity to push that to the front, and then have all this information behind. We're engaging visualization experts, because one of the things that I'm really clear on is that we as educators are going to get down in the detail, right? We're going to be doing it and working on it with the students. Employers and others are not going to be able to do that. They need to be able to look at this information, and in that 500 milliseconds that you've got, be able to make some kind of interpretation of that. So because it's got to have that kind of utility and be valued. I don't want anybody to look at it and go, I've no idea what this is telling me. I'm not interested. Yeah. So it's got to be able to make that kind of connection. And so students have to be able to ultimately be able to modify it in some way in order to present what the employer or somebody else has said that they're looking for.
So from my point of view, I think this is the work that is being done now for Commonwealth, state and territory ministers. And I think it is important how we're able to represent these attributes that have been demonstrated in a learner's profile as part of, only part of the HSC. But I am also interested in why I want teachers and students to do this, is in effect, while people are still at school, help to structure how they look on learning for life. What does this actually mean? And it's not just that you've got these badges or these credentials, though the aim is to have an education passport that keeps all that together, but to get you to think about how you are structuring the learning you have, the sort of learning when you go for an interview, but we're teaching people at school how to do that, and they will then take that with them for life, and it will become your education passport. It's very attractive because it will instantly connect digitally to all the transcripts that you have already acquired, but it's really helping people to understand what learning for life means. If you talk to students, learning for life, it doesn't, it doesn't have substance. But if we say, well, these are the sorts of qualities and characters, and they're probably going to change over the next 10 years, but right now, these are the sorts of things that you are likely to need in order to maximise your chances in the labour market and to be a good and active citizen. I think that helps at a younger age for people to start to imagine what that learning for life is going to look like for the next 35 years.
Thank you. It's really useful to gain a bit more insight into what the practicality of this might look like. Is there any other questions from the floor?
Just a question in regards to the... I can see where the question from Year 11 came from, and simply the fact that you can get an E and still get your 10 points of credit, so that it can be demotivating for a student. But I'm just interested to find out the subject pathway into uni, and could that incorporate Year 11 results to make subjects more relevant in terms of an entryway? So, for example, if someone wants to do pharmacy, their Year 11 chemistry result as well as their Year 12 chemistry result is part of the equation. I'd be really interested to see what subject-based entry looks like, if you could talk into that.
Well, thanks to COVID, we know it happens. ANU this year, I think, bolted the stable too soon, but as your students will know, they were making offers to ANU on the basis of Year 11 results. Yep. So it just shows you, yes, universities will respond, and there's a whole series of criteria that they can use for selection process. Now, while we were having lunch, I was saying we've got a lot of evidence now that if you get an ATAR of about 90 plus, the likelihood is that you'll do well at uni. If you've got an ATAR of 60 or less, then almost certainly you'll struggle more and you'll need greater levels of support. But the great bulk of people who come to our universities are in that ATAR 60 to 90. And guess what? If you try and trace university performance against how they scored, whether they got an ATAR of 65 or 75 or 85, there is almost no correlation in that great bulk there, because other things come into play. How well you can learn on your own, what sort of self-discipline you have. These are the issues that come into play. So that means that we can be much more flexible in how we recruit people into university.
Okay, it's a really good question, because I think we're all experimenting with that at the moment. I would much rather, if a student wants to come in and do a science degree and take chemistry as a major, I'd much rather they would have done some chemistry at school, because otherwise we're forever saying, well, you're only going to do well if you do this bridging course. And we've got no control over whether they do or don't. Yeah. So, and then they tend to be the students who drop out, and you get these really talented intelligent kids who drop out because, and it's often young men more than young women, and they drop out because it's all too hard. And it's not that they couldn't have succeeded. If they just had a little bit more background, they would have found that first year easier. And it really is, if we can get them through first year, they tend to succeed. So all of these, the research shows, once you get students through the first year of university, it doesn't matter what pathway they've come in through, they tend to all succeed. So their success rates are the same, in other words. So you have some fail, but there's no difference. So what we're really interested in is making sure they're as best prepared as they can. So the one we moved away from ATAR, sorry, that mangled that, didn't I? We moved away from ATAR some years ago now in entry for music. Now, that one actually was really controversial within the university. So we had thrown at us, oh, it's backdoor entry and lower standards, you'll get worse students. Do you know what? We didn't. We got much better students because they had to finish year 12, they had to present a portfolio, they had an interview, they had an audition, they had a music skills test. And again, everything else flowed from that. Higher quality students, really wanting to come in, better retention, better results all the way through, and a lot of those students are going on to do great things. So that was a change we made about 4 years ago, but there was a lot of internal resistance to that. Amazingly enough, there's been very little internal resistance now to going on year 11 based entry or subject based entry, because I think people have, the times have changed, the mindset's changed, and again, people have realised that you know, what we were setting as an entry standard, you know, the ATAR is not a gold standard. Again, it measures some things and it measures the ability of some students, but it's not necessarily a great predictor for a great many students.
Fantastic. And we have another question down the front here, so this will probably be our last question for this afternoon's session. Oh, sorry.
Just a very quick question. I think over a long period of time now, the universities have encouraged schools to encourage students to take those subjects which are going to be useful for the degree direction they're hoping. Yeah. But over the years, it doesn't seem like the universities are playing their part and actually having some prerequisites. And I know you don't want to disadvantage any schools, but I would think the vast majority of schools offer maths and the sciences. So why doesn't universities actually have a lot more prerequisites?
That's a good question. I'll just throw in. Look, it depends on which university you're talking about too. So we do tend to have prerequisites still for University of Adelaide science degrees, not all of them, but we do for a lot of them. A lot of universities have moved away from that because of the disadvantage. We do have schools where, you know, they might have some fairly basic maths, but my partner's a mathematician. At one point, we're in a country town. He ended up teaching the extension maths across 3 high schools because they had nobody. They couldn't actually get a teacher. Curriculum was there, no one to teach it. So we just have to recognise that it's really different experience in the big cities and to a remote town where it's just not possible to offer that in the curriculum. So that's been a move across the country, and it's driven in the way by the federal government because there is a move to make education more accessible, and prerequisites are a barrier. On the other hand, as you said, we want the students to have done those subjects. So it's kind of getting a balance right, where we're saying it may not be a prerequisite, but you will do much better if you've actually done this level of maths or come in with this kind of science or a technology background. You will do much better in a degree in creative writing if you've actually had to write an essay in the last year. We get a lot of students coming in and they haven't, not so much the school leavers, but sometimes the school leavers, they haven't actually written an essay in a very long time, yet they enrol in a subject that's heavily essay-based. So again, it comes back to being prepared, and I think it needs to be an ongoing dialogue about how we do that.
So I think at Western Sydney University, we're a long way down this track now. Like many universities, we work with schools, but we are really working in Western Sydney. 70% of our domestic students come from Western Sydney. So we have worked with principals on a true rewards, is what we call the scheme now, and it's been operating, I think this is the 3rd year, and where we do actually articulate that you will get a place if you want to do chemistry in this school, and you'll have to have these 2 subjects at this level. You'll have to have your HSC, but if you've done that, we don't mind what else you have done. The view from school principals is that takes a lot of the pressure off Year 12 students because they know they've got their place and they know what they want to specialise in, and that's how they will focus. So for us, it seemed to work well. We just at the end of last year did an assessment of comparing how students were performing under that new system than the old 8R system, and our early evidence is that in fact using that true rewards where people can effectively choosing the subjects they want to have counted towards their university entrance, we're getting better university outcomes.
Fantastic, thank you. And we'll take this last question from the front here, if we could get a microphone. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. A question for Martin. A phrase that intrigued me earlier was evidence of past behaviour in terms of the learning profile. A lot of work I do is with the marginalised, and I'm wondering if that speaks a little bit to equitable access to opportunity and how this is going to resolve that. I think there are some demographics that have access to opportunities that others may not. Okay. And the other part of the question is, I see so many students that it's a question of maturation in terms of decisions they make. And so something like my lad, for example, my dad had on, wants to join the Defence Force. If they wanted somebody who'd shown some resilience or had shown ethical understanding, is it too late? And I know we don't want to quantify these things, but there's something about the learning that needs to take place to be absolutely able to present ethical understanding that I'm not sure you can necessarily teach to a 5-year-old. Yeah. There's a couple of bits in there.
Yeah, great. So again, in terms of the promise of the SACE, this has to be an equity vehicle. If it's not an equity vehicle, we're not doing our jobs. So we've certainly been engaging with a wide group of schools, principals and others, country schools, low SAS schools. And as Peter was talking about before, often those students might not get that from formal kind of extracurricular activities. They might be getting it through they might be showing evidence of those behaviours through the school experience, but they are often getting it from elsewhere in their lives. Working on the farm, being a carer, those kinds of things that students are doing. And we want to make sure that this system is flexible enough to capture that evidence as well. One of the challenges kind of across the world in this kind of area, once you start getting right into the nitty-gritty of these things, is about what's sufficient evidence? So how do you kind of aggregate? We've got different teachers maybe in a school providing evidence of this, some stuff coming from outside of schooling. How do you aggregate that together? Now, to look at, let's say, some of the capabilities over time, you'd probably expect to see some kind of trajectory. So, some kind of developmental trajectory. It was low, and then you get higher and higher as you go through over time. You might get a dip in the middle. So now the question becomes, over what time period do you take that evidence? It might be the wrong question, but let's run with that question for a second. Because if you take too long a time period, you're going to end up with the average, which isn't necessarily a true representation of where the student is. If you take too short a time period, you've probably not had enough time to gather enough evidence to have some confidence that that student is at that level. So there's that balance in there, and that's exactly what we're really getting into now with the Assessment Research Centre at Melbourne University to say, what is sufficient. If it's going to authentically represent that student who said, I want this pathway, I've done my PLP, maybe at year 10, that's the kind of person I want to be, I'm going to work on this capability. It's a bit unfair to take what was going on at year 9 and then call that evidence. So we're seeing it as being later on, year 12, last half of year 12, there's other stuff going on there, so where that might be. I think ultimately what you'd be looking for is I think we would be looking for some kind of trajectory over a longer period of time, because whatever that slope looks like, even with some of the dips and things, or even if there was an increase in the gradient later on in senior secondary where students were really putting some effort into that thing, you'd want to be able to see that, I think, because I think the gradient's probably a better predictor than some actual snapshot at year 12. That's kind of a bit further down the road, I think. What would have to be true to get there? Well, we'd have to get good at doing the snapshot before we can do the gradient. One of the challenges that we've got in South Australia is our curriculum and assessment authority is just year 11 and 12. In New South Wales and other places, it's a reception to 12, so you can have much more of a strategic approach to the kind of schooling arc, if you like. So some challenges in there, but some opportunities. But we're definitely grappling with some of those things, and certainly top of our agenda. We've got some ideas of what that might look like, but we're going to have to get into it with schools to make sure that that really is authentic and it's going to work.
I think there was one very innovative idea in the Looking to the Future report, which we did not make explicit enough. We had been asked, as we did that report, to, amongst the criteria, look at ways of overcoming disadvantage. Always get that. And of course, we looked at a lot of the programs introduced in the last 10 years, some very successful, some less so, to help Aboriginal students, to help migrant students. And we thought, well, what can we add to that? There's all these programs. I think what we added was a quite different way of looking at disadvantage. Because, in fact, as we were starting to consider the learner's profile, we had, if you like, a bit of a collective epiphany, where we suddenly realised that all this disadvantage that we were trying to help students overcome, wouldn't it be good if we said, there is a good side to disadvantage? And that is the extraordinary thing of what the learning is you actually having to undertake to do it. But the key is to be able to recognise that. And so that's why we were saying in our report that, as I say, if you're having to interpret for your parents, if you're going on Aboriginal men's business, if you're looking after disabled parents, these are extraordinary disadvantages. But rather than just have a program to help you with that disadvantage, why don't we be more fundamental and say that when we then articulate your learning attributes, that will become a key part of it. It will actually help to turn that disadvantage into a learning strength. And I think that is quite a different way of starting to look at how we can do this.
Fantastic. So I think it is clear from today's conversation that it is a very exciting time to be in education, and we all have a part to play in putting students right across the country at the heart of these sorts of conversations. So will you please join me in thanking our panellists with a rolling round of applause. So thank you once again to Professor Peter Shergold, Professor Martin Westwell and Professor Jennie Shaw.